So, good afternoon, good morning. I had intended something very different when I got excited about ions in January. The world ended and I didn't have the time I thought. So I'm going to present really kind of just the seed of what I'd hoped to get to, which is a focus on this really simple question. Should we be trying to inform our behavioral models with behavioral experiments? And I'll just be clear, I think the focus of the work that I'm speaking on is a little bit different than the tools and toolkits we've heard about this morning. I'm very much focused on not framed field experiments in the sort of a experimental economic sense, but definitely standardized game instruments played across larger groups of people who don't necessarily know each other or interact that much. That's kind of the focus of the tools that I'm speaking of. And so, and even there, games, which is what I'm going to call them, serve a whole bunch of different purposes as experiential learning tools, as well as research functions. And I think a lot of cool things happening on the learning tools side. It's nice to see the kinds of game legacies that you see in terms of how games and follow-up feedback sessions can help people resolve or understand nonlinearities in CPR dilemmas. A couple of great examples with Ruth Meinzendick and Marco Jansen's work in groundwater and in health and hygiene. And then on the research side, there's all kinds of stuff published where people are making empirical inferences from either sort of context-free or framed games. Some of them are better than others. Kind of a couple of guiding posts along the last 15 years or so that I have felt have been really quite wonderful. 2006, Jansen and Ostrom's paper outlining the sort of different toolkits and the scales at which you're able to implement them as tools for informing agent-based models. And then around the same time on the sort of experimental economics side, a bit of a critical review to kind of put frame field experiments, games in their place and be aware of the different things that people are bringing into games and what you ought to and ought not to be trying to pull from them. And then much more recently, this nice review of different tools for different purposes and making a lot of really good linkages between if this is your goal, this is the kind of process you might be trying to apply. This is Voinov et al. So the very specific little sort of slice of this bigger picture that I want to talk about today is this challenge of informing models with games. And as I started with, the question is, should behavioral experiments be used to parameterize behavioral models? And where I started with this was no. And where I got to was, well, maybe. No asterisk, and I'll sort of explain where I think that there's kind of a narrow space where we can do this appropriately. Now, of course, I think many of us are still talking about we should be doing this more, and I just kind of want to pump the brakes on that a little bit and say there are very particular contexts in which I think this is appropriate. And so the way I'm going to do this is just highlight a couple of problem areas that I get stuck on whenever I'm trying to think about how to design a game tool and a game experiment to inform a model. So the first one is this problem when you get up to wanting to use a standardized instrument across a large group of people, and that's reconciling the sort of real-world heterogeneity that you observe and want to parameterize in your model with your need for statistical power in order to make any qualified inference. And where this is further problematic is that we have some science that says people bring all kinds of things into the game. They bring their identities, they bring the group dynamics and whether or not they do know each other in the group. They bring their understanding of the game, and this all comes from a nice paper by Miller, Cardenas, and Lynn Ostrom. And then on top of that, they also bring in how their day was and what they're doing, or whether they got to have lunch, and whether they've used a tablet before, all kinds of different things. And so as researchers, when we come to the games trying to pull things out, we know that we're looking for some very specific slice of a whole bunch of different signals, and we've got to design that appropriately. Now, the challenge is when we design experiments, we kind of, we don't have a lot of money, we don't have a lot of time, we don't have a lot of people's attention, and so we tend to work towards very specific hypotheses that we can test. How were things different under one very specific change in conditions? And I don't mean to crap on that, because that's really good experimental science methodology, but the challenge is that it doesn't let us look at the kind of heterogeneity among agents or nonlinearity, differences in the way people respond in different contexts that we need to get to. So I just have to move all the Zoom pictures to a better place on my screen. There we go. Okay. Okay. So as just one or two examples from the work that I do, this is a game that we've implemented in a few different countries called non-crop share, where we're looking at the ways in which we can encourage farmers to move away from pesticide use towards shared natural enemy services and natural biocontrol. And this is implemented in that logo. We play it on a bunch of tablets. We have a similarly structured game looking at human-animal or human-wildlife conflicts. This one's called Goosebump, and we played it in an Orkney looking at how to encourage non-lethal as opposed to lethal control measures for animals that have a pest sort of role in a landscape. The name Goosebump was my crowning achievement of 2018. Into gangster movies, it works on a number of different levels. But as much as I might like some of these games, we're kind of limited in what we can do with these. These are both symmetric coordination games, and that's great from an experimental perspective and a hypothesis testing perspective, because it means that I get 4 clustered data points out of each game instead of maybe just one. It's great for statistical power, but then I'm stuck when I want to do anything, because this tells me nothing about what happens in physically heterogeneous landscapes, or what happens when you have power imbalances among farmers. What happens if a large farmer can crowd out and invalidate the actions of another. I don't get any of that from games like this. And so if I'm kind of making a first entry in my problems list, it's that sort of goals of parameterizing agents seem like they're incompatible with the goals of good experimental design. So that's my first issue on the board. So the second part is, and a lot of this is really focused on natural resource dilemmas and natural resource management, which is a difficult set of livelihoods to be engaged in. And I get stuck with how much I'm able to make use of framing information to really pull in the signal that I want about how people make decisions. I can't, for instance, capture how miserable it is to have to go out in the middle of the night to open or close your gate as an irrigator. And I can't recreate or capture in the game how great it can be to find some new livelihoods opportunity that lets you stay home more and spend more time with your family. Can't capture any of that. It's really difficult, I mean, however carefully you framed it, to know what people are bringing into the game and how much it's just an intellectual thing, how much they brought in any of their feelings. On the experimental economics side, kind of the thing that you're expected to do in all games to make them valid is to make them incentive compatible, meaning you've provided some kind of appropriate performance-based incentive that aligns. I'm sorry, if I could just have the favor that you mute your microphone, unless you have a question for me, if that's all right. Thank you so much. So, this only helps you to the extent that the decisions that are being made in the game are truly economically motivated. Maybe you're capturing how difficult it is for farmers to maximize their incomes or smooth out income variation. But to the extent that they're bringing anything else in, it's really difficult to get that. And in truth, I mean, even when you do have a sort of a purely economic decision that's being made, it's really hard to know what the right scale of incentive is to bring in. And again, like as soon as you get away from that, it's really difficult to know how to scale that stuff against all these other things that matter in the way we make decisions. So my kind of second gripe with games is we can't control for joy or misery. We can't easily condition on non-information, non-economic choices. So that's my second kind of concern. Now the third has to do with sort of the different stylized realities that we have to create both as modelers and as game developers. So I think we're all familiar with the idea that there's some set of real processes out there. And we have some idea of what we think our model does. And then there's what our model actually does, and kind of minimizing the gaps across these blocks are what we know as validation procedures and verification procedures. But then beyond that, we have the set of things that you can ask someone to do in a game. And I don't really know what to call that. And maybe it's been well documented somewhere else and I haven't read it. But the challenge that I'm hinting at is that when you play a game or run an experiment, you have this little narrow window of time to help your respondents understand the game and anchor it to something that they can relate to. And, so if we think about a sort of a data quality window, we probably have about 30 minutes when your participants are learning the game. You have about another 30 minutes where they're engaged in the game treatments that you provided. And then you have just tired and bored and not really very good data. So you kind of get a little bit stuck. It may not be that the way you can best represent these processes in your model is something that you can communicate within the sort of span of someone's attention. And so I think it's kind of unlikely that it's going to be easy for you to get one-to-one linkages from what you get in your game into your model. And you've got to be creative. You've got to be thinking about what are the qualitative signals or what are the qualitative inferences that I can make from my game and then apply qualitatively to what's in my model. So my kind of third problem in my list is that good design choices in your game context might not be the good choices for your model. All right, so I'm almost finished. Again, I love games. I'm not just trying to list a whole bunch of things I don't like. One more thing that concerns me is the way we run game sessions and the way we kind of encourage people to think on the fly. So we now have half a century of the things that became behavioral economics. We've known about fast and slow thinking processes for some very long period of time, and Kahneman and Tversky's system one thinking that is fast, intuitive, heuristic, the gut response to something. And then system two thinking, which is slow and deliberative reasoning. It's this is an unfamiliar situation. So system one gets applied all the time for us for things that we know or we think we know. And system two then kind of gets, yanked in when we encounter something that we don't and we try to make an informed decision. So when we run a game in some quick session and game conditions map really well onto things that our participants are familiar with, I'm guessing that a lot of the time we're engaging that intuitive system one thinking. And when we present new treatments, things that they're not familiar with, we're probably pulling in system two. But the rub is that we're often forcing them to make decisions about how to use resources in a very quick amount of time, in a couple of minutes. And it's not obvious to me that we're always going to be tapping into the kind of right, cognitive machinery, the right sort of deliberation if we're asking them to make a decision that they might ordinarily think about for a day or a week or a month. We're asking them to make it in a minute or two. So the kind of last concern that I have about, broadly applying games work to inform models is that we may not be capturing the problem-solving processes in our games experiments that are the ones that matter. Okay, so it's easy to just complain about things. That's how we're trained. What I want to do is suggest other things that we could do and think about what's an appropriate sort of, standardized games-based modeling research space. And so I have kind of two suggestions. One is for how we ought to think about applying them in models. And then another is a sort of suggestion of work that I'm trying to get going to do a better job with these kind of standardized instruments to capture more of what we want. So the first thing is to be mindful when we do this sort of link from games to model that the empirically informed model preserves whatever were the limitations of our games experiment. And what I mean there is that as good social scientists, we know and we teach to our students that any response you get from a respondent is this co-production of you and them and your instrument and the context. And so the best we can ever do is, again, change one thing and look at what's different. There are very few things that we would pull out of, certainly there are very few, experimental parameters that we would pull out of a survey and treat as absolutes. We would treat them as sort of relative responses relative to the instrument that they were obtained in, and we would try and reproduce those conditions as best we could if we wanted to look for differences. That's what we would do with our surveys. We have to hold on to that. We have to remember that all we're looking for is, we're comparing responses under some changed condition, controlling for all the different confounding factors we can think of. And so that it's the difference that you observe between conditions that is your finding. It's not this group of people has a risk coefficient of this. It's this group of people behaves differently than this other group of people, or this group of people behaves differently under this particular condition. And that's the way I think we've got to be careful about informing our models. So that's kind of the first thing I kind of wanted to say. And then the second was trying to find ways for games to map better onto real decision-making. And I think the way to do this is find more opportunities to play them when all those non-economic factors I've been talking about are salient, and it's easier to have them inform the decision-making in the game. And I think some of that comes from playing them at the right scales and playing them at time scales that engage the right deliberative processes. And so for me, with colleagues, we've been doing a lot of work with mobile phones-based data collection and jumping out into trying to do less facilitated or non-facilitated games with rounds of gameplay that are taking place over a much longer period of time. Maybe it's days, maybe it's weeks, maybe you find an opportunity to WhatsApp chat with your participants once a week, walk through the next round, and then go on your way for another week, things like that. So in a sort of current context, some colleagues and I have set up some experiments to examine, so that we're not just jumping off onto something we can't explain, how game responses for a very simple game compare in person, in pen and paper games, in person with mobile devices, and then remotely with mobile devices. And so we have a couple of different modes we're playing with. Some of you may be familiar with Android ODK as a tool for data collection on mobile phones. There's an updated ODK tool, it's called ODKX. And what's wonderful about this is it allows for bidirectional syncing, meaning that any two devices can talk to the same table in the cloud, which is kind of the core requirement for having a dynamic game. So we're developing some tools there. It's kind of complicated. And so for now, I'm working much more in the low-hanging fruit of Google Sheets, which is, as it turns out, this amazing toolkit for engaging people all over the world in the same place, being able to know that you're all looking at the same thing at the same time. And so we have a simple minimum effort game that's being played in Tamil Nadu, framed around social distancing. Participants have kind of a client interface that they look at. We have a sort of master sheet that manages the game. It's quite easy to operate. And again, we're sort of looking at what are differences across in-person versus remote sessions. And then we have a couple of months of follow-up to see if there are any kind of differences in the experiential learning that you get from these game contexts. And I have in another project plans to do the same kind of thing to help inform parameters for a PES trial that we'll be running in Malawi over the next couple of years. So I'm kind of exploring what can work there. And I guess the thing that I'm trying to do is be mindful of how can I make this less of a game and align it more with real experience. Still using, a standardized instrument that I'm applying across a lot of people. So summing that up, and I apologize if I've gone long, I think that when we bring data from experiments into games, we've got to be really upfront and make sure that the experimental conditions are more prominent in the way we're applying them to models. And if anyone is interested in kind of writing this up, or can point me to someone who's already written this up, that'd be lovely. And I also think that we can do a better job of making use, in the last 5 years, mobile broadband connections to rural areas all around the world are just through the roof. And so I think we can do a lot more now to change, sort of transform the way we engage with respondents in rural communities and change what people are bringing into these game contexts. Up until now, I've been doing all of this. I don't have a graduate program, and I've never had a graduate program. I'm moving to Boston University for the next academic year. I will have opportunity to take on students. So if there are any students in the room, or if you know of someone who might be interested in this kind of work, please feel free to reach out. Thanks very much for your attention, and I guess I'll leave it there.